One of the most valuable things I have found in my leadership journey is getting transparency right. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about in this video, as I think this is such an important skill for leaders. And it's only going to become more important with the current economic uncertainty and with what AI is bringing to the table. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. But before I get into it, if you watch this video and you like it, I'd encourage you to check out other content of mine and be sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. And hey, encourage others to do the same. Okay, so with that, let's get into this. And let me first start by saying who this video may not be for. And the first one is this, is if you are a leader or a future leader who isn't quite sure if transparency is the right pathway, if you're still kind of on the fence on that one, this may be a little premature for you to dig into this. You may still find it valuable, but I would actually encourage you to take a look, go Google it and look up what Satya Nadella has done with Microsoft. He is, in my mind, one of the primary examples of someone who has taken transparency and done it right, and it has transformed the business. So if you're still skeptical that this really is a good thing, and maybe you are on the fence of, well, it's good for people, but is it really good for business? Check out what Satya has done at Microsoft. I would also say trying to move what I'm going to share here as a step forward may not be the right first step for leaders who have not built a strong foundation of trust. Doing transparency well is built on a foundation of trust. And you cannot have effective transparency if you don't already have trust. So if you don't start with building that foundation of trust, and granted, can transparency be part of that? Yes. But if you lean too hard on the transparency side before you've built trust, that may backfire. And you may find yourself going, well, see, this transparency thing didn't work out, when really what was lacking first was the trust. So those are two caveats for someone who may be watching or listening to this. I also want to start by defining what I mean by transparency, because I think there's a lot of misnomers around what transparency really means. One example I hear, or there's a spectrum. Sometimes people think when they hear transparency, it's this reckless oversharing of information. If you're transparent, it means you just tell people all the details of everything going on. And it's not that at all. It's also not the opposite of that, obviously, of secrecy, where you don't say anything. You just keep everything close to the vest. Neither of those, second one, obviously, is not transparency, but even just the oversharing is that. I would say almost never in my entire career and life can I think of a situation where sharing absolutely everything would have been wise. And I also don't think I can think of a situation where hiding everything would have been wise. And so I would say transparency, doing it right, falls somewhere in the middle of this. And just a couple of examples where I've seen this just go sideways is just to give you an idea of when is it oversharing is a bad thing. I was with an organization once, and I remember an all employee email went out that had the salary information of every single employee. Now, I know recently there's been a lot of talk about greater salary transparency and all those things. I think there is some truth behind that. But let me just tell you right now, sending out the salary information of every employee in the company is just a straight up bad idea, regardless of how much you may be for greater salary transparency. Just a bad idea. It's oversharing of information. Now, on the flip side, I have seen people overreact to that. And I remember being with an organization that felt the need to hide everything. And we had a massive org change that ultimately cost the company $1 billion in lost revenue by not being transparent. And you can see how these extremes, as with any of my content, if you listen to anything that I talk about, for me, it's about finding that right balance. And that's really what transparency is all about. The way I think about transparency is it is this balance of strategic and thoughtful openness balanced with discretion. There's nothing wrong with discretion. And I am a big advocate of being discreet about certain things, but balancing that very tightly with strategic and thoughtful openness. And I tend to lean more towards the open. So when I say strategic openness, to clarify what I mean by this, I mean sharing as much information as is relevant to the individual you're speaking to or the group of individuals you're speaking to based on, and this is where the thoughtful piece comes in, their unique needs, their role, and even taking into consideration their personality with this. So this is why, going back to what I said before, if you don't have a strong, trusting relationship with the teams you're working with, this doesn't work very well because it becomes very hard to be thoughtful and intentionally open. Because if you don't know the people you're working with, if you don't have that trust of, hey, I might make a mistake, but we understand each other, we know enough about each other, we can trust that it was well intended, or you haven't spent the time getting to know the people around you well enough to know what is their personality or what is their need or what is the scope of their role and what information may really directly affect them, type of a thing. I think of an example with this where I remember working with a recruiting team and was talking with them, and they did not have some information about some of the things that were happening in the org. And they were finding out details from candidates they were talking to who had heard about this through Glassdoor and LinkedIn posts. And so, again, thinking back to, had the leader in that instance been thoughtful, known the implications of this, they likely would have shared more information with those people. Now, does that mean they send an email out to the whole company saying, hey, these are all the people that just got riffed? No, of course not. But being thoughtful requires knowing, what are the people on your teams doing? What are they working on? What are their personalities and what are their needs? On the discretion side, though, and this is the balancing act that you have to focus on, is being really intentional, being intentional when you're choosing not to disclose information. So rather than just saying, well, I can't tell that, or I'm not going to share things, it's about thinking about, but why is it important for this not to happen? And then the key with this is, when it comes to transparency done well, it's about sharing and letting people know there is information that I have that I'm not at liberty to share with you. And here's why. And here's when I will be able to give you more details. To me, this is one of the keys of getting this right, because every instance, not every, I can think of a few times where it hasn't gone well, but for the most part, 99 times out of 100, when I have been strategically and intentionally discreet while pairing it with that second proactive communication of letting people know I'm being discreet. I am being discreet right now, and this is why. Here is what I can share with you, and here's when I'll be able to give you the rest of those details. And I think that's a really important thing. I think sometimes we take the discretion part as, well, these are just details I'm not going to share. And so we close that off. And the reality is, over the years, I have seen time and time again, regardless of how discreet a company thinks it is, regardless of how discreet a leader thinks things are, people are far smarter and far more in tune with things than you may ever realize. And granted, we've all had that person who, despite all the information, it still didn't click. That's not the norm. And I have continued to see this in organizations as they figure out, well, we won't tell people this and they'll just find out later. Like, no, they're already finding out now. People are already speculating. People can understand things. Someone somewhere is not doing transparency right and is doing the reckless oversharing. Someone somewhere is going to make that mistake. And all it takes is one for that information to start going. And so if you are not being intentionally discreet and saying, listen, I'm not hiding the fact that there are things that I cannot discuss with you. As I look at my leadership journey with any team I've ever run, my team is keenly aware when there are things that I have details on that I am not at liberty to talk about. Now, granted, are there some things that I am intentionally discreet about where I don't share, hey, I just need to let you know that I know things you don't? No, but it goes back to being intentional about the openness and saying, is you knowing that I know something that has absolutely zero impact on you relevant? No, it's not. It's not adding anything to things. So I think it's really important to get this right, because sometimes I've seen when I've talked with leaders in organizations and try and push them to lean more towards transparency and that strategic openness with the right kind of discretion, there's a little bit of hesitancy. And oftentimes when I dig into that, it's often from these examples of reckless oversharing. And they think that is what transparency is, or they're thinking it's some flavor of that. And I just want to be clear, that is absolutely not what I'm talking about. Now, I want to get into 4 stories, personal examples that highlight what I would say are 4 things that are really, really important to get transparency right. And I'm going to connect it to stories that I've had over the years. The first one is the context. So this goes back to being really intentional and thoughtful about how you're approaching transparency. And one of the things you need to be thoughtful and intentional about is the context. So I remember at a time early in my career, I came into details on a significant org change that was supposed to be, I would say, secret, that someone swung the transparency pendulum the other way and recklessly overshared. And I came into contact with that information. And my peers at the time were a lot of new career folks. They hadn't been around the block, didn't have as much exposure to some of the things. And so very quickly, this information started to spread because as I was talking with some of these folks about what was going on, I quickly realized that they were filling in the blanks of what they didn't have with information that was far worse than what really was going on. So it was difficult because at the time I thought, well, I don't want to perpetuate what's going on right now. And I have information. These people around me, they don't have the information. They're filling in the gaps. But I opted, and this was a lesson learned for me, I opted to go more towards secrecy and going, well, I don't want to share information. So I'm just going to be quiet on this. And what I learned was that secrecy and contributing to that secrecy when people were already starting to put pieces together and fill in the blank, it was not good. And when people have gaps, they fill it in with bad information. And so it's really important to set that context. So even going back to the strategic openness, figuring out how to message things and when you're being discreet, how you have that conversation about why you're being discreet and what you're being discreet about. It's really important to set the context for that because if you don't set the context, people will assume the worst. People will assume, well, the reason you're not telling me is because I'm going to get fired. I'm on a list of people who are going to get ripped. Those are the kinds of things that people fill that in. So when you're being open, you need to be sure to set the context for folks so people understand, hey, there is information I'm not at liberty to talk about, but that information is related to this. It is not related to this. And being really proactive about that, because if you're not clear on that second piece and set the context of what information and why you aren't sharing it, people start to go, well, there's information that's not being shared and they're not telling me what it has to do with. So obviously it must have to do with this. And so you have an opportunity to get in front of that, set additional context, and provide people with more information. And I've learned that the hard way. Another one is relevance. There was a time in one org where I knew there were some new leaders coming into play. It was a new leadership team that was coming in from a different part of the org. And I made the decision to what I would consider kind of cross over the line into reckless oversharing. Had nothing to do with my team and my organization, had nothing to do with that. And what I saw happen was 2 things. One, again, people fill in gaps with bad information. So I didn't have details about the bigger stuff that was going on. So I share this random thing that's happening over here and people start drawing their own conclusions. Well, if it's happening over there, how much longer till it happens over here? Now, was there anything actually coming over here? There wasn't. But because of that just lack of information, the gaps started to fill in with that. The other thing with it was because these changes were happening and people started going, well, how long before this creeps over here and all this other stuff, performance just came to a screeching halt. So in an effort for me to be transparent, I had not taken the time to really consider the relevance of this well and say, is this org change over here that's happening have anything to do in the near or far term future for our organization? And had I really done a better job at the time of thinking through those things, I probably would have said, you know what, I probably don't even need to share this information because it's completely incidental. And, if someone on the team brings it up or things like that, like, then I'll deal with it. But I think considering the relevance of, does this have direct implications on the person or the people that I'm sharing it with? If it does not, you may choose, and it would be wise to choose more towards the discretionary side, because you may end up causing more problems. Now, again, you need to be thoughtful in this because sometimes you may think it doesn't have implications. And this goes back to the trust and the team building. You may not realize work that you're doing. And I've had instances of this where I wasn't close enough to things to realize that, hey, this project actually overlaps with this group of people. So what may seem like a disconnected thing actually has direct implications on work that was happening within my teams. And so there are times you're going to make mistakes and you're going to go, oops. But if the closer you are with the teams, the more you're going to be able to assess the relevance and start to see some of those intersectional things that you go, you know what? This may seem disconnected, but I know enough about the team. This is relevant to them. So, and I do this a lot when it comes to project planning. When there's things I can't share, I'll talk about, let's talk about how we may think and proceed with this project, because there is some information about something unrelated to us, but intersectionally related, that you need to take into consideration. The third point to take into consideration when it comes to how to do transparency well is being really empathetic about things. Um, this goes back to building strong relationships with the people that you work with, and you need to feel out your team. I remember once there was a team member I had, and they were going through a divorce. At the same time, there was some major changes happening in the organization. And I didn't know that. I didn't know they were going through all these things. And so when I shared information, they reacted unexpectedly. Let's just say that. It was a very unexpected reaction for what was happening. And so for me, it was one of those things where, as I look back on that and reflect on things, had I spent a little bit more time getting to know things, I may have changed the timing or the context in which I shared this information, being sensitive to the fact that, what, this person was not in a state to be able to wrestle with this, and maybe now wasn't the right time to do this. Going back to some of the things I said earlier about like taking into consideration the personality, this ties to that empathy thing. Some people will handle ambiguity and uncertainty much better than other people. And you need to be able to get a feel for that so that you can nuance this. I think that's another thing with transparency, is that sometimes there's this persistent belief that you have to treat everyone the same. So if you share this kind of level of information with this individual, then I guess you have to share the same level of information with everyone. And my experience has been that is absolutely not the case. I know certain people that I've worked with who, as I got to know them, they grew that self-awareness, and together we grew the self-awareness that this person cannot handle information before there's enough details. And if they know the information before there's enough details, they cannot function. They just are so caught up in the what ifs and the maybes and all this other stuff. I've had other people who have been on my teams that you could tell them the world was going to end next week and you didn't know anything about it and how it was all going to play out, other than that it was happening next week. And they would go, thanks for the heads up. I'll do as much as I can over the next week. At least now I have the context to know, don't plan too far out beyond that. Some people just are able to do that really well. And you won't know if you don't take the time to get to know them. And that's where that empathy factor weighs in, is deeply understanding the individuals you're working with so that you can nuance what transparency looks like for you. The fourth and final one on this is all around timing. Fantastically delivered messages can land catastrophically if you get the timing wrong. And the example I gave before of the individual who was going through a divorce at the time was one where, had I just waited another week, it probably would have been a very different situation. But, here's another example of this. There were some possible changes that were about to happen in an organization I was with once. And I had come into the information, and to me, I had said, you know what, this is really important information. I'd gone through kind of my checklist. It was relevant to my team. It had all these other things. And so I had an all team meeting that happened to be on the schedule already. And I made the decision to share that information with everyone all at once. Hindsight, I had not briefed my leaders, the people leaders on my team first. So I thought, well, it'll be okay. I'll share with the whole team and then I'll catch up with them and go into more detail later. And what I quickly found out was that that was a poor timing decision, because given the nature of the information, I didn't have enough detail to give enough information. So there were a lot of questions that I didn't have answers to that then ended up going to their direct managers. And for the direct managers, they were just in the state of processing what they had just heard. And so they hadn't even developed a point of view. They hadn't had a chance to talk to me about the implications on the work for their teams and things like that. And now they were being asked at the same time. And so as you think about timing of some of these things, cascading information, you may share the right information at the wrong time, and it can be catastrophic to what you're trying to do. So you need to take that into consideration. What does that cascade look like? Do you need a cascade? Maybe not. Maybe truly the reality of things is this is an urgent matter. I just need to make sure everybody's aware of it. I don't have a better option. Other times, like in the instance I just described, it would not have killed me to say, I'm going to wait till 2 days from now to brief my leaders on this. And then I'll talk to the whole team. Or perhaps I pull my leaders together first to let them know so they can quick answer some questions and then we go after. So again, that timing, as you look at the four, this is kind of the four things that I go through when I consider, hey, how am I going to do transparency well? It's the context, it's the relevance to the audience, it's the empathy, understanding them and where they are as individuals, or cohesive, I guess you could say, but then also the timing. The last piece that I would add on this is being transparent. Even just listening to some of the stories that I've shared, it is a skill. This is not something that you're just either good at it or you're bad at it. The good news with that is because it's a skill, it means it can be built. This isn't just a decision. You don't decide, I am going to be transparent or not. Is there an element of, well, you have to decide, do you want to be a transparent leader or not? But from there, your ability to do that well is going to take some practice. And that means you're going to have to be comfortable with the fact that the way learning happens, the way you build skills is you do it, you fail, you get feedback on it, you reflect on that, and you try again. And so when it comes to being transparent, don't think as a leader that you have to get this right every time. There are lots of examples. And even to this day, I continue learning new things. And I've had some recently where I've done things that, upon further reflection, I would have done them different. You're never going to get it perfect, because no matter how many times I've gone through this, there's always some unknown variable you can't take into account. And so even being transparent about that, a lot of times when I talk with teams and I talk with other leaders, I talk about the fact that letting people know that there are variables that I may not have, and I'm doing the best that I can. And again, this goes back to why building trust first is so important. And if you just lean into transparency and there is no trust, your best efforts as transparency are not going to be treated as such. The other thing is there are actually ways to measure whether you're being effective in transparency. So this is something that if you're a leader and you're looking at building the skill, which I would encourage every leader to, look for ways to measure that through your team engagement. I know I regularly do pulse checks and engagement surveys with my teams to see, hey, how are you feeling about things? Do you feel like you know when changes happen? Why? Do you feel like you have the right lead time with things? And that they're very simple questions that can give you pulses on that. And you actually will start to see that in performance. So you can actually assess how your team compares to others. Now, again, you have to do that differently depending on things, but I can actually, over the years as I've had larger organizations, I've been able to see in overall team performance which leaders are more transparent and which ones are less. So, do I have any quantitative data off the top of my head to say this is a quantitative metric? No, but qualitatively and through my own anecdotal experience, I have seen and can measure the effectiveness of teams based on the effectiveness of the leaders to be transparent. So, with that, let me just say, while I've given you some frameworks and some things to consider as you think about being transparent, first of all, one, if you're not convinced it's the right thing, like I said, go check out what Satya has done at Microsoft, then come back. You can start to look at this. But there is no universal approach. Let me just tell you that right now. If as a leader, you're trying to grow and be more transparent and you're looking for the playbook, just tell me the play to run so that I can do transparency well. It doesn't exist. There isn't a universal approach because you're dealing with people, you're dealing with unique situations. And so you're going to have to feel through this. And you can use those 4 grid lines to see, hey, how am I measuring this? You are also going to make mistakes. And there are going to be times you are doing nothing. I can think of so many times where I was doing nothing but trying my best to do right by the people I was leading. And it just did not land that way at all. And I totally flubbed it. And I could look at that. And there were times when that happened where I went, you know what? I should have just kept my mouth shut. And I'm so glad that I didn't, even though I totally flubbed. As I look at the ongoing, longer term sustaining effect of the work I did, I would say it's always been worth it. Even when I've made catastrophic mistakes, even when at the time it looked like I was doing damage, the vulnerability and transparency about even how we got there actually built stronger, trusting relationships within the organization than I ever could have imagined. So if you're questioning, is it really worth it, even if I take some punches? Let me just tell you, my experience has been it absolutely is. And the last thing I will say is this all sits on the foundation of a strong, trusting culture that you as a leader are responsible for building. So while transparency can help you get there, it's not the magic bullet to do that. And there is work that you're needing to do in addition to just being transparent to build effective teams. And I would say make sure you're doing that work well. Leadership, it's not a position, it's a choice. And it's a commitment that you make to serving your teams and serving them well. Hopefully you found this helpful, and we'll see you on the other side.